your cell phones at this time, and there will be an opportunity for questions at the end of the lecture. Please type questions in the live stream chat if you're viewing it online. Thank you.
And she was very gracious and very patient. And so I thank them for all the efforts that they've gone through. Will Geiger sent me some sound bites, and I have tried to be a studious student, but forgive me if I make mispronunciations. And then I need to take a moment to thank Wishkitan Elder Marie Olson. She donated marvelous books about Tlingit culture to the UAS library, and my books have been inaccessible to me, and because of the books I was able to borrow there, and also my cousin Marilyn Doyle loaned me her books, so I thank both of them. And then I need to acknowledge my husband, who's just been so supportive, and my cousins, particularly Francine and Laird, who would not want me to spell out the many ways they were supportive of me as I prepared for this lecture. So Gunesh Chish to them, to you, for being here, and to those on live stream, and those who will watch this event down the road. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I've entitled this lecture, The Place Where Your History Came into Being Through Us. This is a quote from Elizabeth Nyman. When Elizabeth Nyman uttered these words, she was speaking to her colleague, Jeff Lear. He's a linguist. She was so committed that one, he as a child of the Yanyeidí, because he had been adopted, that he know his history. And then she wanted to collaborate with him so that her descendants and all Yanyeidí would know their history, as well as the children and grandchildren of the Yanyeidí. And I also think she knew that there were clans whose ancestors were the Yanyeidí, and she wanted them to know their history too. So she worked with Jeff Lear, and together they published a book, and I'll be referencing that book as we move through this talk. So, as Chuck mentioned, this talk is a synthesis of what is in the literature, and it also lifts up the regalia and an artifact of the Yanyeidí. I hope that as you hear the presentation, you will recognize that sometimes I use spellings that will not seem familiar to you, and that's because I chose to capture the spelling in a quote the way it appeared in the source. And probably there'll be a few misspellings there that legitimately are mine, but for the most part, it's how it was captured in the source. And I also ask for your forgiveness because my intentions are to share what I have learned. If anything causes offense, it's not meant because Lillian is wanting to give offense, so I apologize ahead. For this talk, I will share a bit about me, and then we'll go to a couple websites so you can get an extent of how far Yanyeidí extend in this territory. And then we'll talk about the origin of the Yanyadi clan name, discuss attributes of hemlock trees, and then I'll share about how the Yanyeidí sold their lands in the Yakutat area. We'll learn about migration stories, and then we'll talk about Yanyeidí Ani, our land, the markers in the T'aaku watershed, and then I'll wrap up by briefly mentioning how the Yanyeidí fiercely protected their territories. So, about me, this is my maternal line. All the women you are seeing are Yanyeidí wolf brown bear. My mother, Kotchkei Dorothy, so loved this land and the people on this land and her clan. If you were present at an event at the Elizabeth Peradovich Hall and the Yanyeidí were mentioned, my mother would throw up her arms in the air and she'd say, Yanyeidí away. And you could just hear the love in her voice. She was one who recognized that we have relatives inland. And when Sealaska started hosting celebration and our inland relatives were coming, and when I say relatives, I'm not knowing who these people are, but I know they're Yanyeidí, or they're married to Yanyeidí, or they're children of Yanyeidí. Well, my mother would, in her small house in the Juneau Indian Village, she would welcome them to her home. And every celebration, she would mobilize all her children and we'd have a big dinner. And I'm very grateful to my mother for forging our relationships with our inland relatives. The third photo is my great-grandmother, Kukawatsi Jenny. She came to Juneau around 1880 when Juneau was just beginning as a mining camp. We all know that the Yanyeidí had been here for a long time prior. But her people brought her from the Taku and Viet Angun. And I want to share that she learned how to trap on the Taku. And she learned how to trap from her mother, who is my great-great-grandmother. And this was fascinating to learn because as coastal people, we don't tend to think of the women as trappers. But on the Taku they were, and inland they were. And if we have time near the end of the presentation, I'll talk more about that because I think it's such a wonderful thing. And then the next slide is the men who the women in my maternal line married into. 3 of them are Tlingit, they are raven, opposite moiety to the wolf and to the eagles. And the gentleman, the second photo, is my grandpa, Willie Peters, and he was T'aaku Kwáan Yanyeidí from the trap house. So I am a grandchild of the T'aaku Kwáan. And then my dad, Sam, from the Philippines, came here as a young man, 16, to California and worked his way up. This is the Juneau Indian Village in the 1960s, where Chuck said, I grew up. And my cousin Evelyn says it's a strong, small hold on the original indigenous people of this area, because many of the families who lived in the Juneau Indian Village were T'aaku Kwáan or T'aaku Kwáan, and that certainly is true for my family. It was a wonderful place to grow up, lots of houses, lots of children, there's one really sad chapter in 1962 when we lost our beachfront. And that happened when the state of Alaska and the city and a private developer went to court and sued for that title. And sadly, we lost. As I mentioned, we'll spend a few moments visiting a couple of websites. And the purpose behind this is to just establish where the Yanyeidí are. And of course, we know about Douglas Indian Association, and I wanted to take you to their webpage so you could see their logo. Many of the original members of the Douglas Indian Association were from the T'aaku Kwáan. So I'm a descendant of a base role member, as is my cousin Diane here. And you see that as our tribe's logo, we have the double wolf as the head. Now I want to take you to one of 3 First Nations webpage. This is the Taku River Tlingit First Nation based in Atlin. And you can see for their logo, they have the crow, which is almost analogous to our raven, and the opposite moiety, the wolf. And many of their members are Yanyeidí. Now we are going to go to the Teslin Tlingit Council. And for their logo, they have the crest for each of the clans that belong to their First Nation tribe. And in the center, you see the wolf. And that's to represent the Yanyeidí, who are members of their First Nation. And then lastly, we will go to the Carcross Tagish. And their logo is near the top of that slide. You see the wolf and the crow. And then beneath, you see a large representation of the wolf, because this page is sharing historical information about the Yanyeidí, who are members. The Carcross Tagish First Nation consists of Tagish people and Tlingit people. Kaatuk, the place where the Yanyeidí clan name came into being. Kaatuk. If in your mind you can go south about 15 miles to the mouth of the Taku, now let's go into the inlet another 15 miles. You will be at Kaatuk. And in this slide, when you look at the area that's cleared of trees, and you see it right near the water, kind of near the center, that is Kaatuk. In their book, Nyman and Lear talk about how Kaatuk is the place where our clan name, Yanyeidí, came into being. They point out that Kaatuk is the place where the Taku Lodge now stands. They say, Nyman says this in narrative and also through maps. If you look at the maps, on the left-hand side, the place names are in Tlingit. On the right-hand side, the place names are in English. The place name Kaatuk is synonymous with the place name Taku Lodge. Elizabeth Nyman shares the story about the origin of our clan name, and I hope that when that story is loaded back on the place names table in the exhibit room, that you'll visit it, because David Katzig gives a wonderful retelling of this story. I am going to give a summary of what Nyman shares. So imagine a time when the Taku Inlet has this very large glacier, and on one side of the glacier there is a big lake, and on the other side of the glacier there is the ocean, and it's coastal. So there were people living north, and there were people living south. And they didn't know about one another. Well, the leader of Kotchkei was Hoots. He was a wolf leader. And he said to his people that he wanted to build a new house. And his nephew said, what should we build the house of? And he pointed and he said, that hemlock tree. And so they got their adze and they started working on that tree. Well, sadly, it was their only adze, and the adze broke. And at this time, when something so vital like your only adze breaks, as a people, you go into mourning. So they took up the drum and they began to sing. And they sang about their broken adze. The drumming and their voices carried over the glacier to the south, where N'aade'eya and his people lived. N'aade'eya was the leader. He thought he heard some voices and some drumming coming over the glacier. How can that be? Well, he dismissed it. Well, back in Kotchkei, Hoots pondered that cavity in the glacier, and he pondered the river that ran into the cavity and underneath the glacier. And an idea came to him. He took a moose hide boot, and at that time, our ancestors waterproofed those boots with pitch. He took a boot, and he took some willow bark, and he latched it onto the boot, and he released the boot into the river. And the boot floated into the cavity and under the glacier. And it came out on the other side. And it floated in the water. And N'aade'eya sees something in the water. And he tells one of his young men to get in their canoe and go and fetch it. And when it is given to him, he looks at it, and he thinks of the drumming and the voices that he heard coming off the glacier, and now he's convinced that there are people on the other side. So he tells one of his slaves to get the canoe ready and to get some adzes. And so the two of them drag the canoe up onto the glacier, and they begin their trek across the glacier. Well, in Kotchkei, Hoots, looking at the glacier, thinks he sees maybe an eagle, maybe a raven too, flying low over the glacier. So he's intrigued, and every once in a while he looks up, and pretty soon he notices those aren't birds, those are humans. Well, the humans make their way off the glacier, take their canoe, put it into this river, and they head for Kotchkei, the place they had never been, the people they had never known. When they get to Kotchkei, Hoots greets them, and the two leaders talk with one another. And in time, Hoots tells the story about how they broke their only adze, and he says, we're still in mourning over this. We've been singing songs and drumming about it. And N'aade'eya says, I have an adze for you. And he gives Hoots an adze, and in return, Hoots gifts N'aade'eya a female slave. That evening, the two leaders visited, and they were wanting to figure out if there was a way that they could continue to visit into the future, and that their people could get together and visit one another. And N'aade'eya came up with a plan. The next day he implemented it. It will sound a bit rough to our ears, but he killed his slave, and he beheaded him, and returning over the glacier, he drugged the slave's body. And wherever that blood flowed onto the glacier, the portions of ice that the blood fell onto started collapsing and melting. And eventually there's a passageway there. And Nyman says this is why you will find inland people on the coast and coastal people inland, because this passageway had been made possible. Well, back in Kotchkei, they had been busy working to build the house that their leader wanted them to build. And when they finished it, Hoot said to his people, "What shall we name the house?" And then he added, "We will name it Hemlock House. And we will name ourselves the Yanyeidí, for we are of the Hemlock House." And that is how our clan name came into being at Kotchkei. Oh, I might add, compliments to my brother Ben, who allowed me to use this photo of himself. It's taken at the Mendenhall, but I thought it was so appropriate to put this in because he is the leader of the Juneau Yanyeidí, and the leader Hoots was wolf. So in my mind, I was making connections. So let's talk about hemlock, because the Yanyeidí are named after the hemlock tree. And the hemlock tree is very plentiful in Southeast. I think they say it comprises about 60% of our forests. Well, hemlock trees, the branches have beautiful little cones, and they're very abundant when they're out. And the branches are very feathery in appearance, and the needles, when you touch them, they're soft and flat. And our people have understood for a long time that they would be an ideal way to gather herring eggs. And so branches are laid in spawning grounds, and in the spring the herring spawn on them, and we get the wonderful delicacy of herring eggs. Hemlock trees are very shade tolerant. When walking in the forest, you'll find them, they're very abundant, but you'll often also see them at the base of a spruce tree. And they seem to grow in all that shade. And then as the forest ages and the spruce trees decline and the hemlocks get more light, the hemlocks shoot up. They love this light, and they grow tall. And they can live to over 300 years old and can grow as tall as 200 feet. Now, our ancestors had many uses for hemlock, and I outlined some of them here. The ones that relate to food, you can learn more about in the subsistence lifeway of the Tlingit. When I worked for the Forest Service, I worked with a couple of partners, Don Bremner and Joanne Wida, and the elders guided us, and we did a revision because the word subsistence is not a proper word for us to use as Tlingits. So we now have ha-atchayi, ha-kustiyich siti. So you can go through the book and you can learn how hemlock is used for these various purposes. The one that I really enjoyed reading about comes to us from an elder by the last name of Katas, and she talked about how you smoke cockles. And I, as a child growing up, loved cockles. And so I was really fascinated to hear how they were smoked. Hemlock roots would be gathered, and you would take a point, you take the end of the hemlock root and you make it very sharp and pointy. You take your cooked cockle, you pierce the cockle on the hook, and you did this maybe 20, 25 times. Then you tied the root together, and then you took that string of cockles, put it in your smokehouse, and let the cooked cockle smoke. Sounds very yummy to me. Hemlock in relative modern times has been used for a variety of things. During our territorial days, hemlock was used in mine shafts, it was used on piers, was used for fuel. Contemporary uses are largely construction related and for pulp. I say all of this because symbolically for me, being a member of the Yanyeidí Hemlock House clan, I like to think that we as Yanyeidí are resilient and adaptive, just like the hemlock tree, able to tolerate the dark times, but responding so well to the light. And then I also like to think that we as Yanyeidí like to be useful, just as the tree that we are named after is so useful. I like symbolism, you can tell. So now let's talk about the lands that the Yanyeidí once owned in the Yakutat area. And I want to share that in relaying this information, I based what I'm going to share on Lena Farkas's account in a National Park Service publication, on Andy Hope's uncle's account, he lives Yanyeidí, and on Maggie Harry's account as summarized by Frederica de Laguna. As much as possible, I rely on Tlingit scholars and cultural bearers. I also want to say that in preparing this presentation, I had the privilege of meeting with Bob Paulo for 3 times and learned so much from those conversations. So let's talk about the areas the Yanyeidí once owned and the clans that purchased them. So my husband created this map for us, and you see where modern day Yakutat is, and then this is a subset of that larger map. And the first area I want to talk about is Knight Island and Eleanor Island. And the Guinea bought these islands from the Yanyeidí. And then the Guinea men began to fish here in Humpy Creek. The fish were very plentiful. And according to Lena Farkas's account, the Guinea were approached by these men who asked them, "What are you doing here?" And the Guinea didn't know that this was territory owned by other people. Well, they were told to leave, and their boats were damaged. And when they got back to their village, they said what had happened. And in their village, they had a brother-in-law who was very prominent. He was a T'aaku, and he didn't like hearing what had happened to his brothers-in-laws. So he said he will purchase Humpy Creek, and he will purchase it from the Yanyeidí, which he did. The next area I want to talk about is the Otlane River. And I learned about this area primarily from Andy Hope's uncle. But I will tell you that living in Southeast over the years, I've had friends in the Yakutat area tell me as Yanyeidí, "You know, your people once lived there." And that's happened to me 4 or 5 different times. And so as I read about these sources, pieces of the puzzle was starting to fall in place. Well, Otlane, there was a village there where the ancestors of the Yanyeidí lived, and they called it the Big Animal Village. And it was named that for a reason. Mountain goat, deer, all the big game was very plentiful. And the area was also very beautiful. Sadly, the village eroded away because it was on a river. T'aaku people were very attracted to this land. And I visited with Judy Ramos about this, and I will not tell the T'aaku story, but I will just say to you that they offered to buy the land, and they offered multiple times, and the Yanyeidí refused. And then finally the offer was so good, our ancestors decided not to refuse, and they sold their land. Maggie Harry describes the journey that the Yanyeidí took after selling Otlane. She says it was 3 months walking, and she describes that after leaving the head of Yakutat Bay, they went over a narrow glacier in the Nunatak Fjord onto the Alsek River headwaters to Kwáan to Atlin and to the Taku. I was sharing with Richard Carstensen that I was researching migration stories, and he said, "Lillian, let me do a map for you." And Richard kindly last night did this map. And it's a map that is very much conjecture. So suppose, just suppose, this isn't saying that this was in 1750, right? This is just a best guess, right? It's not based on anything. But anyway, this is what the topography of the land would have looked like. And I gave, Richard, I gave him the place names, and he figured out what would be the most likely route given the place names. And this is what he came up with. And last night, my husband and I took a piece of string and we measured it. And then we looked at what constituted 100 miles, and we came up with maybe a journey of possibly 400 miles. That's a real rough ballpark. And then I started thinking about the fact that Steve and I love doing trekking. Before the pandemic, the longest trek we did was 210 miles. It took us 20 days. And I think about that trek in northern England and how we had a small backpack on our back, and every night we checked into a B&B, bed and breakfast. We got fed in the morning, then we went on our way with our little backpack. Yeah, 20 days, piece of cake, right? Well, then I thought of my ancestors, and I thought about a whole community on the move, walking over a glacier, taking their precious belongings, taking what they had acquired when they sold their land. And I'm in awe, I'm still in awe. And so Richard did another map, and this one is, if this were today and the trek was taken, and I share it only because he included the place names there, and I thought it would be useful to see them on the map. So we're going to talk about a different route that is documented by Yanyeidí, but it's so easy to get migration routes mixed up, because I really feel that the Yanyeidí were traveling down many of the rivers in Southeast and traveling up the rivers. So I thought, to refresh our brains, let's have some photos of Yanyeidí regalia. And this is Judy Franklin wearing the beautiful blanket that Mildred Sparks made for her. Judy was invited to a party up in Kwáan. She doesn't remember the year. And she was asked to represent her mother, Alice Nelson, and the Yanyeidí people of Juneau, her family. And I'm so grateful that Mildred Sparks gave this blanket to Judy. It has the wolves on it, the double wolves. But this project that Chuck and Rosita and their team are organizing, it's so that there'll be information for our school district to use in curriculum development. So what a time to lift up Judy. She was an administrator in our school district, and she was the one who convinced the Juneau School Board to meet in the old A&B hall. And they had a meeting that night, and the elders and the members, native members of the community, were asking the school board members, why aren't you teaching our culture in the schools? Well, the school board that night decided maybe we better adopt a policy. And Judy retreated into the kitchen with a gentleman, Steve, he married us, our renewal vows. What? Plotnick, sorry, I had a mental moment, senior moment. Judy and school board member Danny Plotnick retreated into the kitchen of the old A&B hall, and they wrote out the policy that was adopted that paved the way for there to be Indian studies and cultural studies in our Juneau School District. So I personally think it's very wonderful that Judy was gifted this blanket. So Andy Hope, on a web page, he was the executive director for Sharing Our Knowledge Clan Conference. He summarizes an account that his uncle told him about, and his uncle is Yanyeidí. And it's similar to the account that you heard earlier with the Yanyeidí selling a plane to the T'aaku. And Andy's uncle adds in that they used bear trails as highways in addition to the glaciers. And then he shares that the Yanyeidí went all the way to the headwaters of the Stikine. Boy, that would have been much more than 400 miles, right? Well, there they met the Tahltan, and the Tahltan pushed the Yanyeidí back, and the Yanyeidí made their way to the Taku River, came there, settled in Taku Harbor, some going further south into some of the other nearby harbors, some going all the way to the mouth of the Stikine. And those that settled at the mouth of the Taku now comprise the core membership of the DIA, the Douglas Indian Association, forgive me. So here we have a slide. The photo was taken by Andrew Roberts, Yanyeidí, of two Yanyeidís in Teslin. One is Alaskan and one was a Teslin member. And they're both wearing their wolf button robes. So the next story I want to share with you relates to Yanyadi migration. And it comes to us through Viola Garfield, who documented it in a paper she wrote. She was a professor, anthropologist with UW. And then I'm going to weave in here some oral history that comes through us through a song sung by, not me, but by Susie James, and through information shared with me by David Katzig and Rosita Whirl. So the Yanyeidí, for a time, were living on the Stikine. When migrating down the river, they came across a very large glacier, and it blocked their journey. Two of them were older women, and that realizing that they had lived most of their lives, they volunteered. They knew how important it was to head south. The Tahltans had been pushing on them. And they volunteered to get in a canoe and to go under the glacier. And they made their journey to the other side, and when they got to the other side, they gave a sign, and the rest of the people knew that the passage would be safe, and they followed. David Katzig, as I said, has given me a recording of a song that Susie James sang, Push the Canoe Off the Shore. And Susie James was married to a Yanyeidí. And Rosita Whirl translated that song for me. And she shared that it had been years since she had heard it. She had been a member of the Mark Trail Dancers, and they had adopted the song, and they had used it as their land suit song. And it actually had been sung in the US Senate Rotunda. I think that's quite an amazing history for a song. Whirl explains in the translation, imagine one of the women having a very long pole. And very long poles are very handy when you're canoeing on a river, especially if you've got some shallow water. Holding the pole, she began to sing a song, and the song was all about pushing decisively, pushing deliberately, pushing non-recklessly, having in mind your goal. What an appropriate metaphor for pursuing land claims. When the Yanyeidí reached saltwater, they built a house. They named it Hitlain, Big House. And after a time, the Yanyeidí split up, and they went different directions, some making their way to Prince of Wales, and they became another clan, some going north. Another slide of Yanyeidí wearing regalia. Here you see 4 Yanyeidí women wearing their eagle regalia. Coastal Yanyeidí also, we claim eagle as one of our crests. And I remember the first time I learned this, I was surprised because so long for my youth and my early adulthood, it was the raven and the eagle. Well, I learned that after the raven came to us, then the wolf. And when you think of the continuum of Tlingit history, for most of the time, we were raven and wolf. And raven and wolf married into each other. They were, as anthropologists would say, the two moieties. It's only relatively modern history that we became the raven and the eagle, the lovebirds that we're all so familiar with. So coastal Yanyeidí, we also claim the eagle. We say we're eagle wolf or wolf eagle, and brown bear. The beaded eagles were beaded by Alice Nelson, and they were gifted to her daughter Judy. So let's talk about another Hitlane. The story of this Hitlane comes from William Paul. William Paul, the first attorney among the Tlingit people. His writings have been recently published in a book that you can purchase, The Alaska Tlingit, Where Did We Come From? William Paul observes there was no other house that sent its children further or wider than Hitlane. He describes the house as being rather large. You see the dimensions, 80 feet by 60 by 30. He says that discord began to unfold within Hitlane, and I love this phrase. We began to battle, the battle that exhausted its people. They packed their belongings into canoes, and they gathered at different places near the mouth of the Taku. And an individual who was a songwriter among them began to compose a farewell song. It's very short. And voices travel well over the water. And all of them were feeling remorse. They were going to be leaving this precious, beloved Hitlane. And they were going to be dispersing. They were going to be leaving their relatives. And so they all began to sing this song. We, the people of Hitlane, we are going away, scattered and shattered by war, our beloved great house, never to see it again. According to Paul, some of the Yanyeidí went northward up the channel, some went southward along the mainland, some crossed over into Admiralty, some later went to the west shore of Douglas, across from Juneau. Many of the former took on new clan names in the lands that they traveled to. But the ones who settled in Douglas retained their identity as T'aaku Kwáan, as Yanyeidí. The lyrics have been added to over the years, and you can go to the book and read the full song. And in the song, it talks about, it has been 500 years since we have left the mouth of the Taku and Hitlane. And it was, to my knowledge, last sung at a kuich in Wrangell. So Garfield, Viola Garfield, who I referenced earlier, also documents the same story. And she documents in an article that is included in my bibliography. And she talks about the dispersal of the Yanyeidí, and she says many of those who dispersed to different areas assumed different clan names. So here we have some information about Goldschmidt and Hawes, and in their publication there is a map. They refer to it as Chart 6. Many of you know that Goldschmidt and Hawes were on an assignment by the federal government. They were here in Southeast, 1946, I believe, and they spent a couple of months traveling to the different communities, and their whole purpose was to meet with old people and young people who were Alaska Native and find out what the uses of the land were. And the federal government wanted to be prepared when, more land claims. So they did this, and the two authors self-admit in their publication that when it came to being in Juneau, they were only here for a few days, and that the Taku men were out fishing. And so they say, we haven't been able to gather enough information about the uses of lands in the Taku. One of the people that they heavily quote is Jenny Claney, who I earlier introduced you to her as my great-grandmother. And while she isn't exclusively quoted, she's extensively quoted in that section about the Juneau-Douglas territory related to the Taku portion of it. She says in the publication that the Yanyeidí claim the river and that the others come in there because they were married or related. And I share that because it's part of the literature. It also is affirmed by Elizabeth Nyman in her book, Jackie Williams in his book, and by Andy Hope's published works. And what I want to say is that I believe we as Yanyeidí people hold very close our opposites on the Taku, the Ishkitan. And as Rosita Whirl once said to me, and this is so very true, no clan exists in isolation. And I think that's what we need to keep in the forefront of our brains, that we all have shared history that intertwines us. So now I'd like to talk about some markers that are important to the Yanyeidí. And the first one I want to reference is Yayue Mountain. This is at the confluence of two rivers at the headwaters of the Taku. And there's a story that I'm going to give you a little teaser, because Jackie Williams in his book says if you're Yanyeidí, you're welcome to tell the story, but you have to tell it completely. And we don't have time for that. So the teaser is that there was a very unfortunate, brutal act that happened right here. And it upset the Yanyeidí so much that they went into planning and preparation, and they had a battle with the Tahltan people. And Jackie Williams in his book describes all of this, and he describes how the Yanyeidí won the battle and what resulted from it, and the fact that there was a new governance on the Taku, and that was a governance by the Yanyeidí. And then there are beautiful accounts of the peace ceremonies between the Yanyeidí and the Tahltan, forever establishing their respective territories. And a wolf, not surprising, a wolf plays a key role in this story. And the wolf becomes solid and a part of the land. There's a canyon that's important on the Inclin River in the Taku watershed, and this wolf becomes a part of the fixture of the Yanyeidí territory and a marker for the Yanyeidí. It's called the cry wolf. And you can read about this in Tlingit Elder by Jackie Williams. And I want to share with you that Jackie Williams is the son of Elizabeth Nyman. When he was born, he was taken from Elizabeth by a relative. Many of us who are native in Southeast know about reincarnation, and we know that new babies that come into the family are often thought to be those who have already walked into the forest coming back to us. And Elizabeth Nyman's relative was missing her brother so much, and Jackie, as a baby, held the name of this precious brother, and so she wanted to raise him, and she did. And I know that this has happened in my family, that a baby born was believed to be a reincarnation of a loved one, and the baby was raised by another. And it wasn't because the baby wasn't loved by the natural mother, it was just our way. So now I'd like to share a story that comes from Elizabeth Nyman. It's the Battle of Two Giants, and it's one that David Katzig tells very compellingly. These two giants are living on either side of the Taku River, and they get along pretty well. They agree on everything. And then one day, one of the giants says to the other, "The Taku belongs to me, it should belong to me." Wasase says that. And the other giant says, "No, the Taku should belong to me." Well, Wasase decides he's going to take this argument to another level. and he beheads the other giant, rips out his heart, throws it into the water. It becomes T'aaku Kwáan, the heart of the Taku, and pulls out the windpipe. Well, after he had done all of this, he was feeling pretty bad. And he decides that he is going to position himself and permanently be a fixture on the Taku. And he locates himself here at this cliff. And he says, people who are truly self-confident will find sustenance from my sides. And this is true because the seagulls like to nest here, and seagull eggs are a delicacy of the Tlingit people. And those who are brave enough to climb these cliffs are rewarded with seagull eggs. There's another story about Wasase that I'd like to share because it really gets my imagination going. Swanton in Tlingit myths says that the north wind lived on the Taku, and that raven came for a time to live with the north wind. And I like this. I like this a lot. And it doesn't surprise me at all. And the reason why it doesn't surprise me is because this is the Taku Glacier. Let's consider some facts about the Taku Glacier. One of the thickest known alpine glaciers in the world. Almost 5,000 feet thick in its thickest sections. Largest glacier in the Juneau ice field. When most of the glaciers were retreating in the world, the Taku was still advancing between 1890 and 2015. And then for a few years, it held its ground. And scientists studying, I can't recall how, I think there was a special camera and they were getting daily pictures. Because it's pretty remarkable, the only advancing glacier in the world. Then sadly, on November 19th, 2019, a photograph captured the beginning of the retreat. The last of the advancing glaciers is now retreating. That was a sad day for me. I had to reach out to several people because I just had an affinity for that glacier. You know, being Yanyeidí, being from the Taku, growing up, hearing about the Taku, it just felt to me like an old friend was starting to retreat. So Nyman, in her book, says that there's a waterfall near the Taku Glacier, and she said the water runs so cold from that glacier that we didn't drink the water from it. So isn't that interesting? The north wind living on the Taku and the thickest glacier and water so cold you can't drink it. Chuck, are we at a certain time?
We're close.
We're close? How many minutes do I have? Maybe, can you give 3 minutes? I can do it in 3. So so we've talked about some of the houses among the Yanyeidí. We began with Hit Lane, Hemlock House at Kotchkei, across from Hole in the Wall Glacier where the Taku Lodge is. We've talked about Hit Lane, and we've talked about Hit Lane at the mouth of the Taku on the Stickeen River. And I didn't talk about the fact that there's a Hit Lane in the T'aaku Winter Village, but there was. So it's not surprising to us. Houses get rebuilt. Hit Lane rebuilt several times. Now, we didn't talk about Grizzly Bear House, Hoots Hitty, or female Grizzly Bear House. And Jackie Williams talks about these houses that are Yanyeidí, and they're unlike other houses. They're not a tribal house, they're like a bunker. Imagine you have people pressing on you and they're not too friendly, tall tan. They would retreat to these 2 houses. And Jackie Williams shares that the grizzly bear had special powers for the Yanyeidí. And these 2 houses were never penetrated, despite efforts to light them with pitch. The houses wouldn't burn. Despite efforts to penetrate the house with logs, they couldn't do it. So the Yanyeidí felt very safe in these two houses, and I think there's a special relationship that we have with the brown bear because of it. Great-grandma Jenny Claney references tribal houses at the mouth of the Taku and at Bishop's Point, but doesn't name them, sadly. Just want to share a bit of regalia. This is a headband given to Peter Esquiro Jr. in Sitka by his father. It's at the Sheldon Jackson Museum. You can visit it. SJ believes that it's 100 years old at least, maybe older, based on photos showing similar sorts of bear paw headbands. An important piece of regalia, McClellan talks about seeing headbands worn at a Yanyeidí party in Teslin in 1940. I love her ending of that article. She says that at the end of the kui, or she called it potlatch, all the Yanyeidís howled. And anyone who knows my brothers would know why I smiled when I read that. Here are some beautiful pieces of artwork, a blanket made by Alice Nelson for her daughter, showing the bear. And I love the two Crimson Bears, beaded. They both graduated from JDHS, Crimson Bears. And each of them were gifted those. And then a beautiful wall mural given by Nishka William Stanley Sutton to Judy and to Carl. They each received one. Bear and two cubs. You see the two cubs on the upper left and right corners. And then just consult these sources and learn how the Yanyeidí protected their territory from the Talton, the Russians, and the English. I say that with fondness. My husband's English, but my ancestors would not let the English remain in the Taku. I think they're smiling down on him today. So I began this presentation with a slide that showed the beautiful lands of the Ak people, the Yanyeidí and the Wishkitan. And now I end the talk by sharing with you slides of places on the Taku. Gunesh Chish for listening to me. Thank you, SHI, for this opportunity.
So much. That's a lot of information. Do we have questions from the audience for Lillian?
Oh.
You mentioned the bibliography. Thank you, that was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
You mentioned a bibliography. Would you be willing to share that?
I believe SHI will be sharing that. Part of this project is Sealaska Heritage documenting the histories of clans, and I think their intent is to create a publication. Chuck, you might know more about the details of that.
Yeah, well, eventually we're going to have publications on clan crests, the origin of clan crests for different clans. We're starting one with 5 clans coming out soon, and Yanyeidí is on the list to do it. But if you email me at chuck.smythe@sealaska.com, I can share the bibliography with you.
Okay.
We have a question from online audience. This person says, I am learning that my clan, the Yanyeidí, is one of the clans that branched off from Hitclain. Can you tell us which book you were referencing that talks about the Hitclain song?
Oh, yes. That's in the William Paul book. And you can get that from Amazon. I recently purchased a copy. It's rather expensive. It's $70. If the person who is joining us live stream lives in Juneau, UAS has a copy, and Gunesh Chish Marie Olson for donating her copy to UAS. So I encourage you to check your local library wherever you live and see if they have it and get it through interlibrary loan. And I'm sure SHI Library downstairs has a copy too.
Yes, I can confirm that. We have a copy. This other lady person says, Goodness cheese for sharing your stories today. These stories are so important for us to hear. You have much to share.
Ganashish.
I think that's it for the questions online. Are there any other questions from the audience? Well, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. I have one question for the audience, if I may. And it's just I likely will be sharing this PowerPoint again, and I want to know, was it relaxing for your brain to see photos of our Yanyeidí art between the migration stories? Did that help, or was it that distracting? I would just like to get a sense. Thumbs up if it helped. Oh, good. Thumbs down if it didn't. Oh, thank you. That's important for me to know. Thank you. Guneshish again for being here.